The immediate trigger for the war was the assassination on June 28, 1914, of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, by the Bosnian Serb Gavrilo Princip. This set off a diplomatic crisis when Austria-Hungary delivered an ultimatum to the Kingdom of Serbia. This crisis quickly sucked in all of Europe because of the complicated system of alliances that had been formed over the past few decades. Within weeks, the major powers were at war, and the conflict soon spread around the world. There were several larger causes behind the war: territorial and economic conflicts, nationalism, militarism, and imperialism. But the immediate origin was when Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph became convinced that Austria could take action against Serbia without the other powers interfering, and declared war July 28th. The cards began to fall. Russia mobilized in support of Serbia. Germany had promised to unconditionally support Austria and attacked Russia's ally France, but invaded through neutral Belgium, which caused Britain to declare war on Germany. Over the next few months, here's the general outline. The German march on Paris was stopped, and after the race to the sea failed to give a breakthrough, the Western Front settled into trench warfare and a battle of attrition. The trench lines would change little for several years. On the Eastern Front, the Russians were pretty successful against Austria-Hungary, but failed in their invasion of East Prussia. Austria-Hungary repeatedly invaded Little Serbia and was repeatedly pushed out of that country. And at the beginning of November, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening new fronts in the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, and the Sinai. There was also scattered fighting in the European colonies in Africa and the Far East. Now, there had been war plans afoot for a general European war for years, going all the way back to the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Many people saw such a war as inevitable. Two of those war plans were the German Schlieffen Plan and the French Plan 17. The Schlieffen Plan, designed by Alfred von Schlieffen and streamlined by German Army Chief of Staff Helmut von Moltke, was to attack France as quickly as possible through Belgium and to take Paris and knock France out of the war. After that, German forces would all turn to the east to fight Russia, and thus avoid a long two-front war. The chief aim of Plan 17, devised by Ferdinand Foch and approved by French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre in 1913, was the recapture of the lost territory of Alsace and Lorraine. Austria-Hungary's plans for war are much less often discussed than those of France and Germany, and with good reason. In devising first Plan B and then Plan R, Austria-Hungary assumed that the coming war would be limited to Serbia. Plan B, for Balkans, detailed the requirements for 6 Austro-Hungarian armies in the field, 3 to invade Serbia, with a further 3 guarding the Russian border to dissuade an attack from that quarter. Plan R, for Russia, essentially revised Plan B, allowing for a greater volume of troops to guard against Russian assistance for the Serbs in the south, while assuming German activity further north. This led to 4 armies being deployed against Russia and 2 against Serbia. Here were some of the highlights, for lack of a better word, of the first few months of the war. August. The Siege and Battle of Liege. Although a victory for the Germans, this was something of a moral victory for the Allies, inflicting surprisingly heavy losses on the Germans by the outnumbered Belgians. But the 12 forts surrounding the city were bombarded into submission and showcased the devastating power of modern artillery. The Battle of Mons, the first real engagement between British and German forces in the war. The Germans had mocked the British army openly before this battle. After this battle, they realized that the only fully professional army in Europe was a pretty damn good one. The Battles of the Frontiers. The French army invades Alsace and Lorraine, but is met by German heavy artillery and machine guns. Everyone, I mean everyone, suddenly learns that cavalry charges are a relic of the past, when French losses are devastating, including 27,000 soldiers killed in a single day. The French fall back toward Paris amid 300,000 total casualties. The occupation of Brussels begins on August 20th. On the 23rd, Japan declares war on Germany and begins to assist the British in expelling the Germans from their far eastern colonies and bases. And in late August, the Germans deal the Russians a spectacular and colossal defeat at the Battle of Tannenberg, ending Russia's invasion of East Prussia before it had even really started. In the Balkans, an Austrian invasion of Serbia is beaten back with heavy Austrian losses. September, the Battle of the Marne, a major moment in the war. Paris is saved as British and French troops finally stop the German advance. Aerial reconnaissance reveals a gap in the center of the German forces, and the Allies press their advantage, using hundreds of Paris taxicabs to bring troops to the front. The Germans withdraw above the Ain River. Over the next few weeks, each side would try to outflank the other as the trench lines move ever northward in the race to the sea. In the east, Austrian forces retreat from the advancing Russians in Poland and along the Russian-Austrian border, and the Russians take Lemberg, but are once again beaten by the Germans in the north at the Masurian Lakes. October and November, the First Battle of Ypres. Still hoping to score a quick victory in the west, the Germans launch a major attack on Ypres in Belgium. Despite heavy losses, British, French, and Belgian troops fend off the attack, and the Germans do not break through. During the battle, the Germans send waves of inexperienced 17 to 20-year-old volunteer soldiers, some fresh out of school. They advance shoulder to shoulder while singing patriotic songs, only to be systematically gunned down in what the Germans themselves later call the Massacre of the Innocents. The Battle of Ypres lasts for a month, one of the first of many endless battles of the war. Germans and Austrians launch a combined offensive against the Russians on the Eastern Front. The German army targets Warsaw, but is opposed by enormous Russian numbers and withdraws. The Austrians attack the Russians in Galicia. The Russians fail to press their advantage at Warsaw, and instead begin a split counteroffensive, moving both southward against the Austrians in Galicia and northward towards Germany. The German Ninth Army then regroups and cuts off the Russians at Lodz, halting their advance and forcing a Russian withdrawal eastward. In November, Austria again invades Serbia. Now this attempt would also fail, and when the Austrians retreat 6 weeks later, they'll have suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties and be completely humiliated by the little country they thought they'd have no trouble with. October 29th, the Ottoman Empire enters the war on the side of the Germans. Russian and Turkish troops prepare for battle along their common border. November 6th, in the Persian Gulf, a major British offensive begins as the 6th Indian Division invades Mesopotamia. The objective is to protect the oil pipeline from Persia. 2 weeks later, they capture the city of Basra. December, the Western Front stabilizes in the aftermath of the First Battle of Ypres as the Germans go on the defensive and transfer troops to the east to fight the Russians. The 450-mile-long Western Front now stretches in trenches from the Channel coast southward through Belgium and eastern France all the way to Switzerland. Toward the end of the month, the French launch the Champagne Offensive, a campaign that will continue for months. The Eastern Front also sees its share of trenches as troops dig in after the Russians hold off the Germans in Poland and the Austrians push back the Russians at Limanova. The 600-mile Eastern Front stretches from the Baltic Sea southward through East Prussia and Austria to the Carpathian Mountains. The German Pacific Fleet is destroyed at the Battle of the Falklands, but the Germans are successful in Africa throughout the winter. December 16th, Britain suffers its first civilian casualties at home in the war as the German Navy bombards the coastal towns of Whitby, Hartlepool, and Scarborough, killing 40 persons and wounding hundreds. December 25th, a Christmas truce occurs between German and British soldiers in the trenches of northern France. Soldiers leave the trenches, exchange gifts, sing carols, and engage in a soccer game. This is the only Christmas truce of the war, as Allied commanders subsequently forbid fraternization with orders to shoot any violators. January 1915. The Turkish army is completely destroyed by the Russians in the Battle of Sarıkamış, with tens of thousands of Turkish soldiers freezing to death in the mountains. The Austro-Hungarian army, driven by desperation for any victory, launches a winter offensive against the Russians in the Carpathian Mountains. Further north, on January 31st, the Germans use gas in a large-scale operation for the first time in the war. Although they fire thousands of gas shells, they have little effect as the freezing winter prevents the gas from vaporizing. And this is where we stand after 6 months. Millions of casualties all over the world. Thousands of men dying every day, being blown to pieces, starving, freezing, in the Carpathians even being eaten by wolves. The scale of death never before seen, the scale of stupidity never before seen, as the horrors of a technological war were now apparent to a grieving world. No one had any illusions left of a glorious victory. The only job now was to stay alive and kill the enemy by the thousands. I'd like to now direct your attention to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria was now ready for war with Serbia, and on August 12, 1914, the Austrian army invaded, having already bombarded Belgrade for a couple of weeks. A couple of things to think about, though. Austria-Hungary went to war to punish, destroy, or annex Serbia. But it's really funny when you think how little she seemed to realize that she had a much larger, much more dangerous enemy at this point: Russia. And a lot of the early Austrian maneuvers in World War I are a textbook case in how not to run a war. See, one part of the problem was that war against Serbia was really popular in Vienna. So Army Chief of Staff Conrad sent a lot more troops down to Serbia than you would expect, and a lot fewer to fight Russia than you would expect. And here's something else he did, which really pissed off Austria's ally, the German Empire. In order to send an even larger army down to Serbia, he actually arranged for troops that were heading to Russia to sort of secretly head to Serbia instead, without telling the Germans. So when they found out, they were really angry because Russia had like a bajillion men and Serbia did not. Now the Germans, understandably, asked if the troops could be rerouted back to the Russian frontier. And here is where you get an idea of some of the problems facing Austria-Hungary in this war. Austria-Hungary was multinational and had a crazy railway system that reflected this. In different parts of the empire, the railways were different gauges, so trains couldn't go through. And in some places, the train lines would just end when they got to an internal border, and you'd have to get off and carry stuff, or else go the long way around because Hungary or Bosnia didn't want certain trade to happen with certain people. So when Germany asked Austria if she could reroute her trains and turn the troops around, the answer was no. They couldn't reroute single-track railways in the middle of total army mobilization, so the troops would have to go all the way down to the Balkans before they could be turned around and then sent back to the Russian front. On top of this was a huge fear of railroad mismanagement. Now this was a justified fear, I suppose, because all nations knew that a country that could move her troops around quickly would have a big advantage over one who couldn't. So here's what Austria did. To avoid railroad problems, all of the trains were required to move at the speed of the slowest train on the slowest line for maximum coordination. And that speed was 10 miles per hour, 16 kilometers per hour. That's how fast bicycles go. So the Austrian army invaded Serbia at the speed of a bicycle. But eventually they got two armies into Bosnia, about 110 kilometers apart from each other, under the command of General Oskar Potiorek, who had never actually seen any military action before. Now, his army was poorly trained and equipped, and of course, the Slavs in the army were a little hesitant about fighting other Slavs, and Potiorek was also willfully ignorant of the modern aspects of warfare. Serbia, by contrast, knew all about modern warfare, having been in 2 wars in the past 2 years. The Serbs were also going to be fighting on their home territory, in the mountains, and managed to mobilize 500,000 people out of a population of only around 4 million. Pretty impressive. Of course, a lot of these people didn't have any rifles or any ammunition, but they certainly had confidence, which is odd, really, considering that there were 4 million of them and 45 million of the opposition. But Serbia really believed they were going to win. So the Austrians began crossing the Drina River to engage the Serbs, and we'll see how that went next week. In the west, the French mounted their first offensive of the war, occupying Mulhouse in Alsace on August the 8th. The German army counterattacked on August the 9th at Cernay and forced the French out of Mulhouse on the 10th. The French retreated to Belfort and then, on August the 12th, mounted a new offensive under General Paul Pau. Now once again, we'll see how that went next week when France and Germany clash for real. Here's what was happening this week in Britain. On August 7th, Lord Kitchener called for 100,000 volunteers, Kitchener being one of the few who thought that this was going to be a long war. Although, by the 10th, the Kaiser himself admitted some worries about it being a long war once Britain was involved. Now, Britain had no troops at all in mainland Europe, but she was the only country that had a purely professional army. It was small, but it was very highly trained and totaled 6 divisions. 4 divisions were to be sent to France, and on August 12th, the first troops of the British Expeditionary Force crossed the English Channel. In 10 days, they moved 120,000 men without a single loss. Also on August 12th, France and Britain declare war on Austria-Hungary. It's interesting, actually, that England and Austria had been on very friendly terms earlier, and Britain certainly had no commitment to Serbia or anything. But if you look ahead through the August weeks, Britain became the vocal defender of the rights of the Slavic minorities in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, especially the Czechs. On August the 10th in the south, 2 German warships managed to elude the British and enter the Dardanelles. The Turkish Minister of War, the pro-German Enver Pasha, let them enter and said that if the British followed, they would be fired upon. But the Ottoman Empire was still neutral, so the ships were sold to the Turks, given new Turkish names, and raised Turkish flags. On August 12th, 2 naval blockades were established. One to prevent cargo from reaching German ports on the North Sea, and the other was a French blockade to cut off the Austrian ports on the Adriatic. In the North Sea, submarine U-15 was rammed and sunk by the British, the first of nearly 200 U-boat losses Germany would suffer in the war. And in Central Africa, on Lake Nyassa, a British gunboat captured a German gunboat. The German captain was not aware that he was at war with the British. True story. And just because there had been no right time to mention this before, I'm going to mention it now. Back on July 25th, the Kiel Canal was finally opened so that Germany could safely and quickly send ships between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. Now let's think about something here. Now that we have a full European war starting, though not yet a world war. Okay, yeah, we did have gunboats in Central Africa, but still. We actually have a bunch of totally different wars at this moment, caused by different forces that make one big general war. Now, we've talked about this in earlier episodes, but let's briefly go over it again. Austria wants to go to war against the little guy Serbia because of guys like Chief of Staff Conrad, who have big imperialistic dreams. The Russians don't think that it's necessary for an entire Slav state to be destroyed because of an assassin or the Black Hand or whoever, especially when it's their only ally in a sensitive region. The British didn't much care about Serbia's fate. They were concerned with Belgium and German hegemony in Europe. The Germans want to take on Russia now because they fear that in a few years, Russia will be too powerful. But to do that, they also have to deal with Russia's ally, France, who wants revenge on Germany for the last war. See, these are all different wars, happening at the same time, but for different reasons. Just thought I'd point that out. This is where I'm going to leave you today, with German forces 80 kilometers from Warsaw, but come back next week when the carnage really begins. If you want to know what happened in the last episode, click right here. And let me know how you liked it too. If you have any questions, you can put them in the comments below. And if you follow us on other social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, you can learn more about the Great War. We have behind-the-scenes footage and all kinds of background information for you. We really do. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to a Great War recap special covering the months of November and December 1916 and January 1917. As November began, 2 huge battles, the Somme and Verdun, were still raging on the Western Front. At Verdun, the French had just taken Fort Douaumont, and it looked like they finally had the upper hand there. They soon occupied the whole of Vaud, but while the battle continued all month, it was relatively quiet. Over at the Somme, it was anything but quiet after the first few days of the month. The British attacked repeatedly, especially after Commander Sir Douglas Haig decided a small victory would make him look good at the Allied leaders' mid-month meeting at Chantilly. And while they did see some successes, the battle finally came to an end on the 18th. It had seen over 1 million total casualties in under 5 months, and the Allies had not even taken their first day's objectives. There were many battles raging all month long on the 2 Romanian fronts. As November began, things looked okay for the Romanians, who were fighting all 4 Central Powers, but danger soon loomed. Russia tried to send help, but terrible logistics meant it would take weeks. Meanwhile, German General Erich von Falkenhayn broke through the Romanian mountains on the 17th, and Field Marshal August von Mackensen began crossing the Danube the week after. Romania, with its huge reserves of grain and oil, was in trouble, and the month ended with 3 columns of men converging on Bucharest, the capital. On the Italian front, the 9th Battle of the Isonzo River ended early in November, with the Italians unable to break through, and that front settled down for the winter. One front that did the opposite was the Macedonian front, which came to life the 11th. Over the next week, the 5-nation army encircled and then took Monastir, though they were not strong enough to push much further. In other news, the ocean liner turned Allied hospital ship Britannic, sister ship to the Titanic, was sunk. It was the largest ship sunk during the war. Germany declared an independent Poland under German supervision. This was an attempt to convince Poles to join them in the fight, but since it didn't give Poles any real political power, it backfired, and there were 2 big celebrity deaths in November. The great German flying ace Oswald Belky flew his last, and Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph passed away at the age of 86 after 68 years on the imperial throne. This was a huge crisis for his empire, for in many ways he had been the glue that had held it together. His grandnephew, the Archduke Karl, became the new emperor. November ended and December began with turmoil in neutral Greece. The country was split in 2 by this time between royalists and Venizelos, those loyal to Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos. The Allies had hundreds of thousands of troops stationed in Salonika, but when they landed just a few thousand at the Piraeus and marched to Athens, they were attacked by royalist forces. The following week, there were massacres of Venizelos there, and the Allies imposed a blockade on the country and occupied the Cyclades. The Allies next demanded control of the post, the telegraph, and the railways, and also demanded humiliating terms from the Greeks before they would lift the blockade. In Romania, the Central Powers captured yet another capital city as Bucharest fell. The Allies had yet to capture one. The defenders destroyed as much Romanian grain and oil as they could to prevent it from falling into enemy hands, but it was still a huge deal. And as the month continued, the Russo-Romanian forces retreated further and further. And though they made strong and spirited defense at Râmnicu Sărat, by the new year they had been forced to retreat across the Sereth River. It was there that the Central Powers' advance would finally run out of steam thanks to exhaustion and supply problems. The Macedonian front went quiet for the winter, but the Mesopotamian front came to life after months of calm. The British had been humiliated there in the spring after surrendering to the Ottoman forces at Kut al-Amara, but now they were heading up the Tigris, re-equipped and revitalized to try again. They made a good start before bad weather ground things to a halt until the new year. Also in the Middle East, the Palestinian front began coming to life again as the British took El Arish the 22nd. They were now in good position to stop any attacks on Suez while being able to provision themselves for their own offensives to the north. At Verdun, the French launched a huge counteroffensive, and it was a big success, pushing the Germans back several kilometers and taking many thousands of prisoners. The Germans were now over 7 kilometers from Verdun, and that battle, the longest of the war, came to an end after 299 days. General Robert Nivelle, who emerged as the hero of the battle, became the new commander-in-chief of the French armies, replacing Joseph Joffre. Now, Nivelle was optimistic about 1917, but among the French armies, morale was dangerously low and mutiny was a possibility. There were a great many political shakeups in December throughout Europe, notably in Britain and Austria-Hungary, where David Lloyd George and Heinrich Clam-Martinitz became the new prime ministers, and in Russia, where the nation was in turmoil. Public opinion began to turn more and more against the Tsar, and his loyal followers like Rasputin and Alexander Protopopov tried dangerous political machinations. So dangerous were they seen that Rasputin was assassinated as the year came to an end. And in the wake of his assassination, the people blamed the Tsar ever more for what they had earlier perceived to be Rasputin's failings. The new year brought with it a whole host of resignations and new appointments within what was now the musical chairs of the Russian government. The new year also began with ideas of peace being floated from several quarters. Each of these imposed conditions on the enemy that were unacceptable, and there would be no peace. Something that would pretty much guarantee that there would be no peace was Kaiser Wilhelm giving the green light to reinstituting unrestricted submarine warfare beginning February 1st. This winter, the turnip winter, had been so harsh for Germany, seriously running out of food by now, that they planned to sink so much shipping that Britain would be forced out of the war. The downside was that neutral nations like Denmark or the United States might join the war, but they planned to win before that became a problem. This was the harshest winter of the war all over, and it prevented all major actions on all European fronts in January, though there was minor action every day, everywhere. However, fighting was picking up in the Middle East. The British secured the entire Sinai Peninsula. They continued advancing up the Tigris, and by the month's end had cleared the right bank below Kut. And down in German East Africa, the Allies were also advancing and took Likuju. Although January wasn't a huge month of combat, perhaps the quietest of the whole war to date, it was a month of planning. Woodrow Wilson was still planning peace. Robert Nivelle was planning Allied spring offensives. The Greeks were planning guerrilla war in the Balkans, and the German foreign minister telegraphed a plan to Mexico, whereby Mexico would attack the United States with German financial support. Wheels within wheels. And this is where we stand after 2.5 years of war and millions of dead soldiers from all over the world. There is no end in sight, and though the war is quiet for the moment, buried under the snows of winter, when the spring comes and warms the land, the guns will fire again by their thousands, and the men will die again by their millions.